Who is Adolf Hitler? Everyone thinks they know who Adolf Hitler was. Still, if they are asked this question, one answer would be in the mouths of most. Adolf was the dictator who masterminded the Holocaust. Also, add the fact that he led Germany for 12 years, and during his reign, he initiated World War II in Europe by invading Poland in 1939, and ended his reign by committing suicide in 1945. What led a man who was feared by many to go on and commit suicide? Who was he before he was the dictator of Germany? What were his fears, likes, and hobbies? Perhaps no one really cares to know all this. However, if you really want to look at who Adolf Hitler really was, you must choose to see the whole picture. So, let's explore the life of a man called Adolf Hitler. Chapter 1: His Beginning. Adolf Hitler was born a German in Braunau am Inn, a town in Austria-Hungary, which is now present-day Austria, on April 20, 1889. He was the fourth of 6 children born to Alois Hitler and his third wife, Clara Pölzl. Perhaps little ancestry in Adolf's name. His daddy, Alois Hitler, was the illegitimate child of Maria Anna Schicklgruber. So, Adolf's surname could have been Schicklgruber had his father not decided on a name change. Since Alois was an illegitimate child, he went by his mother's name until he changed it to Hitler later in life. The spelling was somehow changed to Hitler in the record book. This is important because the man that Hitler was might have been Schicklgruber. Try to imagine crowds of people yelling, "Heil Schicklgruber," instead of "Heil Hitler." It's weird, isn't it? The early years of Adolf Hitler's life were not very cheerful. He was the 4th child of his parents, but all of his older siblings passed away before he was even a year old. Adolf acquired a Bavarian accent as a result of the family's relocation to Germany when he was 3 years old. Adolf Hitler frequently disagreed with his father since the latter wanted him to work as a customs officer, whereas he was more interested in the arts. Hitler struggled academically and dropped out of school early. Additionally, he kept changing employment because he was unable to settle down, and both the School of Architecture and the Vienna Arts Academy turned him down. Adolf left school at the age of 16 and went to Vienna, where he hoped to enter the academy and become a painter. History would have been very different if he had indeed entered the academy. However, his application to enter the academy was rejected when he was 17 years old, and a year later, his mother died from cancer. His father had died 4 years earlier, and with no relatives willing to support him, Adolf Hitler found himself living rough on the streets of Vienna. He became interested in politics and was heavily influenced by the climate of anti-Semitism that existed in Austria at that time. Chapter 2: His involvement in World War I and II. World War I. In May 1913, Hitler relocated to Munich, Germany. He did this to escape being detained for failing to fulfill his Habsburg Austrian military duty commitment. With the final payment of an inheritance from his father, he paid for this relocation. Until World War I gave his life meaning and a cause to which he could devote himself fully, he made a living in Munich by painting and sketching. Hitler was a valiant soldier, according to every story that has survived. He was advanced to the rank of Lance Corporal, suffered 2 wounds, in 1916 and 1918, and was given several decorations. Hitler seemed to have been taken along by the radical right's escalating political anti-Semitism, despite the fact that he was apparently not prone to protracted political discussions at the time. During the latter 2 years of the war, this political anti-Semitism crept up the military chain of command. Hitler suffered partial blindness in October 1918 after being exposed to mustard gas close to Ypres, Belgium. To a military hospital, he was transferred. He learned about the armistice on November 11, 1918, when he was recovering. As the war came to a conclusion, the young Hitler, who served as a frontline soldier from 1914 to 1918, was impacted by World War I propaganda. Hitler shared the view of many that it was enemy propaganda, not German military failure, that caused Germany to lose the war. Adolf Hitler worked for the German army, Reichswehr, as a teacher and a confidential informant. On September 12, 1919, Hitler attended a meeting of the German Workers' Party, Deutsche Arbeiterpartei DAP, in a beer hall as a secret informant. Hitler developed a coherent philosophy throughout the course of his years in Vienna and on the front lines of battle. His dedication to anti-Semitism based on social Darwinist racial theory and the development of a unifying nationalism based on the necessity to oppose the external and internal power of the Jews appears to have been formed by his service in the army in 1919. Hitler published his first written response to the so-called Jewish question on September 16, 1919. He described Jews as a race, not a religion and not a religious community, characterized the effect of a Jewish presence as a race tuberculosis of the peoples, and identified the initial goal of a German government to be discriminatory legislation against Jews. The ultimate goal must definitely be the removal of the Jews altogether. 2. World War II. Hitler gained control of Germany's war plan from the onset. He instructed the army to get ready for an emergency onslaught in the West after the successful campaign against Poland failed to result in the desired peace agreement with Britain. This ultimately caused two significant planning revisions. The first was Hitler's directive to seize Denmark and Norway in April 1940 in order to prevent a future British presence in Norway. His involvement in the specifics of military operations increased progressively after this point. The second was Hitler's crucial acceptance of General Erich von Manstein's proposal for an invasion via the Ardennes rather than further north, which started on May 10. German armies succeeded in reaching the Channel ports, which they had previously failed to reach during World War I, in 10 days. The British were able to evacuate the majority of their army because Hitler kept back General Gerd von Rundstedt's tanks south of Dunkirk, although the Western campaign as a whole was remarkably successful. Italy joined the war on June 10 and sided with Germany. At the location of the Armistice of 1918, Hitler and the French signed a successful armistice on June 22. Hitler wanted the British to broker an armistice. He then planned the invasion of Britain and the destruction of British air power after this did not occur. Hitler believed that Britain's only chance for defense against German dominance of the continent was an invasion of the Soviet Union. Thus, preparations for this assault started at the same time. The Italian soldiers then failed in Greece, forcing German forces to assist them in the Balkans and North Africa as a result of Mussolini's invasion. The fall of the Yugoslavian government, that had signed an agreement with Germany in a coup d'état in March 1941, further derailed Hitler's ambitions. Hitler quickly gave the command for his troops to conquer Yugoslavia. Although effective, the campaigns in the Mediterranean theater paled in comparison to the Russian invasion. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's intended invasion of the Soviet Union, would only use a small portion of his forces. On June 22, 1941, the invasion of the USSR was started. While the German army quickly marched into the Soviet Union and captured about 3 million Russian captives, it was unable to defeat its Russian adversary. Hitler's interactions with his generals grew obnoxious. He didn't agree with them on the target of the major attack, and by failing to focus on a single goal, he squandered time and energy. Hitler's ambitions of a single campaign were finally dashed in December 1941, just a few kilometers from Moscow, by a Russian counteroffensive. The following day, on December 8, the Japanese attacked American soldiers in Pearl Harbor. Hitler was compelled to declare war on the United States because of his alliance with Japan. He hoped and endeavored, much like his hero Frederick II the Great, to sever what he perceived as the unnatural alliance of his adversaries by compelling one or both of them to reach a settlement. He also mandated the complete wartime reconstruction of the German economy. Hitler's goal from 1933 through 1939, and in some cases, even during the early years of the war, was to drive Jews out of the Greater German Reich. The Jews of Germany, Poland, and the Soviet Union were by far the most numerous victims. In German-occupied Europe, around 6 million Jews were slaughtered during the war. Other groups targeted for persecution included Catholics, Poles, homosexuals, Roma, Gypsies, and the disabled. The defeat at El Alamein and Stalingrad, as well as the American arrival in French North Africa, brought about the end of the war at the end of 1942, and Hitler's personality and manner of life started to change. He oversaw operations from his headquarters in the east, refusing to travel to bombed cities or permit some withdrawals, and grew more and more reliant on his doctor, Theodore Morel, and the numerous medications he swallowed. He not only ordered the seizure of all significant positions held by the Italian army following Mussolini's imprisonment in July 1943 and the Italian armistice, but he also ordered Mussolini to be rescued in order for him to lead a new fascist administration. Relationships with his army commanders deteriorated, made worse by the SS Schutzstaffel division's rising prominence. The U-boat campaign's general failure and the bombardment of Germany, however, made the likelihood of a German victory extremely slim. Officers in a state of desperation and anti-Nazi citizens prepared to overthrow Hitler and negotiate a settlement. The most nearly successful attempt on Hitler's life occurred on July 20, 1944, when Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg detonated a bomb during a meeting taking place at Hitler's East Prussian headquarters. Now that all military commands had been filled with National Socialist political commanders, the army's autonomy had been completely reduced. After that, Hitler's health deteriorated more and more, but he maintained his composure and control, and he continued to have an almost hypnotic influence over his close allies, none of whom had any independent power. The beginning of the end came with the Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944. After this failed, Hitler began to have increasingly far-fetched expectations for success. Depending on the use of novel weapons, German rockets had been launched at London since June 1944, or the dissolution of the Allied powers. Hitler abandoned a plan to lead a last-ditch resistance in the south as the Soviet forces drew closer to Berlin in January 1945, but he never left the Chancellery in Berlin or its bunker. In a state of great nervous weariness, he finally conceded loss was inevitable and made preparations to end his life, leaving the nation he had assumed ultimate control over to its fate. There were still 2 acts to go before this. Later, he narrated his political testament in which he defended his career, named Admiral Karl Donitz as the state's leader, and Joseph Goebbels as chancellor. On April 30th, he bid Goebbels and the few survivors farewell before retiring to his suite and killing himself. Hitler's triumph was a result of post-war Germany's openness to his special abilities as a national leader. Although his ascent to power was not inevitable, no one could match his talent for seizing opportunity and manipulating circumstances to suit his needs. He possessed a level of authority never before seen, both in terms of its reach and the technological tools at his disposal. Millions of people, particularly in Germany but also worldwide, accepted his views and goals in full or in part, while the German people had to deal with what they would later refer to as Year Zero. 1945. By the time he was vanquished, he had destroyed the majority of what was left of old Europe. Chapter 3: The Holocaust and the Cause. The genocide of European Jews during World War II is referred to as the Holocaust or Shoah. 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population, roughly 6 million people, were methodically slaughtered by Nazi Germany and its allies between 1941 and 1945 in German-occupied Europe. The killings took place in pogroms and mass shootings, as well as through a policy of labor-based extermination in concentration camps and the use of gas chambers and gas vans in German extermination camps, primarily Auschwitz-Birkenau, Beek, Chemno, Majdanek, Sobibor, and Treblinka in occupied Poland. Although the Holocaust is often regarded to have been primarily a genocide against the Jewish people, 1933 to 1945, organized mass executions of other racial and ethnic groups also took place during this time. These included populations that were specifically targeted, such as the Roma, Poles, Ukrainians, Soviet citizens, and prisoners of war. Holocaust denialists commonly raise the possibility that Hitler may not have known of the Holocaust. The intricacy of the Nazi state gives birth to this notion. It is true that Hitler personally oversaw the Third Reich's intricate internal structure and made sure that each of his various minions and lieutenants consistently received instructions that put them at odds with one another. However, it has been shown that the notion that Hitler himself would not have been aware of the plot to kill millions of Jews and other people in the Holocaust is absurd. Despite the fact that the infamous extermination camps did not begin operating in full until close to the end of the war, although their construction of them had started years before. To ensure that the Holocaust and its engines of devastation would be backed by an industrial system of death, Hitler and his lieutenants had to work hard to persuade businessmen, inventors, and others to join the Nazi Party. Chapter 5: His Death. Hitler took his own life in his underground bunker on April 30, 1945, as Soviet soldiers invaded the center of Berlin. Although there are some theories on how he died, it is generally accepted that he shot himself. He had just recently married Eva Braun, who also committed suicide. 2 days to be exact, before they both died in a gruesome Romeo and Juliet manner. Both remains were buried and cremated, as per his wishes. Conspiracy theories, though, started very quickly. Hitler's death was originally denied by the Soviets, who later circulated suspicions that he was still alive. However, according to later claims, the Soviets were able to recover his burned remains after using dental records to identify them. Hitler's body was covertly interred, then excavated, cremated, and the ashes were dispersed in 1970. At the beginning of the 21st century, enough books had been written about the history of Hitler than about Napoleon during the last century after his demise. Still, time and distance from the events of his life and World War II have affected the interpretation of Hitler. Adolf is historically known as the principal reason for World War II, and this is his historical importance. In his final will and testament, written just before his suicide in April 1945, he charged the Germans to continue the struggle against the Jews. Above all, I enjoin the government and the people to uphold the race laws to the limit and to resist the poisoner of all nations mercilessly, International Jewry. However, his most amazing achievement was uniting the great mass of the German and Austrian people that followed him. By 1938, Hitler had made Germany the most powerful and feared country in Europe, and perhaps in the world. He achieved all of this without war, and there are now some historians who state that had he died in 1938 before the mass executions began, he would have gone down in history as the greatest statesman in the history of the German people.